June 7th, 1992, Staunton, Virginia. A battered SUV was found abandoned near Elkhorn Lake, deep inside George Washington National Forest. Inside, a man lay motionless, wrapped in a sleeping bag, shot multiple times. Shell casings were gone. Paper stuffed into the gas tank hinted at a failed attempt to burn the vehicle. For the tight-knit town of Staunton, the discovery shattered their sense of safety. Whispers spread. Was the killer his brother, his lover, her jealous ex-husband, or someone no one ever suspected? For years, investigators faced dead ends. No DNA, no weapon, no answers. The case froze in silence, haunting the community like a ghost. And then, nearly 3 decades later, a confession changed everything. This is the story of a cold case that refused to stay buried. Stay with us and don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit the notification bell to follow more true crime stories that expose the secrets hidden in America's darkest corners. In early June of 1992, Staunton, Virginia still felt like a place time hadn't quite caught up with. The main street, with its neat row of brick buildings and faded barbershop poles, echoed the slow pace of small-town life. For Ethan Cole, 34 and tall as the oaks that lined the sleepy roads, every day began with the same simple ritual. Strong coffee, black as tar, sipped while he stood barefoot on the back porch and listened to the world wake up. From the hills beyond, mist rose like a memory, and Ethan would watch it drift, content to believe the world was as calm as the view before him. Ethan was a carpenter, proud of his calloused hands and the neatness of his work. He and his twin brother Daniel shared a modest 2-story house on the edge of town, white siding weathered by Virginia rain, a battered truck parked out front, the yard a riot of wildflowers left to grow tall. Life had never been easy for the Cole boys, but they'd always managed, relying on each other through lean seasons and heartbreaks. Daniel was different, quieter, moodier, quick to bristle at small things, his smile a rare sight these days. Despite the shadow of old resentments, Ethan tried to see the best in people. It was part of what made him well-liked in town. Folks waved when they saw him hauling lumber, and he often stopped to help neighbors with stubborn fences or creaky doors. He didn't have much, but what he had he gave freely. What he wanted most, though, was a sense of peace, a quiet life, a chance to build something lasting. That hope seemed closer since he'd started seeing Linda Harper, a woman who, by all accounts, had already lived through more than her share of storms. Linda was 2 years younger than Ethan, recently divorced from Mark Harper, a former National Guard soldier with a reputation for quick fists and a mean streak. For Linda, love with Ethan meant possibility, a life remade from the wreckage, a chance to heal. They met one rainy afternoon at the local hardware store. Linda, hair pulled back in a ponytail, was struggling with a heavy bag of mulch. Ethan lifted it into her trunk with a quiet smile, and from that small act a relationship blossomed. Slowly, at first, with awkward dinners and shy laughter, but soon with genuine affection. They spent weekends wandering farmers' markets, shared secrets over late-night drives, and dreamed of a future together, somewhere far from the wounds of the past. But peace, Ethan would soon learn, was not a gift the world gave freely. Even in Staunton, where change seemed to drift in as slow as the river, trouble could find you. Mark Harper had not taken kindly to Linda's new romance. He'd shown up unannounced more than once. First in the parking lot of the grocery store, his presence as cold and sharp as a sudden frost. Then at Ethan's own front yard, where he'd leaned against his battered Chevy and glared, making veiled threats that left no doubt as to his anger. The threats unsettled Ethan, but he tried to brush them off. He'd weathered hard times before. Besides, Daniel had his own troubles, money woes, talk of debts he couldn't repay, arguments over bills that had started small but now flared into shouting matches late at night, echoing through the thin walls of their home. The two brothers, once inseparable, now circled each other like wary animals, neither quite willing to admit how far apart they'd grown. Still, Ethan clung to the hope that things could be different. He dreamed of marrying Linda, of building a life together free from the weight of old grudges and new threats. He worked longer hours, saved what he could, and tried to keep his worries hidden. But under the surface, tension simmered, between brothers, between lovers, between past and future. Evenings brought little relief. After long days swinging hammers and sanding oak, Ethan would retreat to the porch and stare into the darkness, the song of cicadas loud in his ears. Sometimes Linda joined him, her hand warm in his. Other times, it was just Daniel, silent and withdrawn, smoking cigarettes down to the filter, while the two sat in uneasy companionship. All around them, the world went on. Town gossip churned through diners and barbershops, tales of bad luck and old rivalries. People wondered aloud what would become of the Cole boys, of Linda, of Mark Harper and his simmering temper. No one guessed that a storm was already gathering, hidden behind the ordinary days, waiting to break. In the last week of May, Ethan's mood grew restless. He told Linda he was thinking of getting away for a night or two, just to clear his head, maybe spend time by Elkhorn Lake in the George Washington National Forest. Linda, worried, asked if he'd take Daniel. Ethan shook his head. He wanted solitude, a little peace before deciding what to do about the growing threats and the weight pressing down on him. "Promise me you'll be careful," Linda whispered as they said goodbye one night, her voice nearly lost beneath the hum of the crickets. Ethan squeezed her hand, but his eyes were far away. In his mind, he was already driving out along the winding roads, through the darkness and into the deep hush of the forest. He wanted to believe it was just a simple break, a pause before life returned to normal. But peace, as ever, would prove to be an illusion. The quiet life Ethan cherished was already slipping through his fingers, as inexorable as the dawn mists rising from the hills, vanishing before he could hold on to them. Unseen by all, the first tremors of tragedy were already working their way beneath the surface, about to shatter the calm of Staunton forever. The days leading into summer felt unusually heavy in Staunton, as if the air itself could sense the friction sparking in Ethan Cole's life. For a while, Ethan tried to convince himself he could weather any storm. He'd survived plenty before. Yet the quiet joys of his blossoming romance with Linda Harper were becoming clouded by shadows he couldn't simply ignore. Ethan and Linda spent their stolen moments together in the most ordinary places. The corner booth at Miller's Diner, the back pew at Sunday service, brief walks through the old oak grove behind the Cole house. They talked in low voices, laughter sometimes punctuating their shared stories, each word and glance a small act of rebellion against the judgments of others. Linda's presence brought Ethan a fragile happiness, her gentle touch a balm for old wounds, but neither could shake the feeling that eyes followed them wherever they went. Word of Linda's relationship with Ethan traveled quickly, winding through the streets and alleyways of Staunton like summer wind carrying distant thunder. Most people kept their opinions to themselves, but not Mark Harper. The town's whispers seemed to reach his ears first, fueling a temper that had never needed much stoking. Mark's glare would appear across the grocery store parking lot or outside the local tavern, dark and unyielding, promising consequences, yet unspoken. His anger soon escalated from sharp words and veiled threats to open confrontation. Once, while Ethan stacked lumber at the hardware store, Mark approached, boots grinding gravel, hands balled into fists. He didn't shout, didn't make a scene. Instead, he leaned in close, voice low and tight, making sure Ethan understood. Staunton was his town. Linda was his past. And anyone who tried to rewrite that history would regret it. Ethan, jaw clenched and heart pounding, refused to be intimidated, but he couldn't help feeling the chill of danger settling in his bones. The pressure didn't end with Mark. At home, Daniel's simmering resentment boiled over more often. Arguments erupted between the brothers about money, bills piling up, debts unpaid, Daniel's feeling that he shouldered too much of the burden. Ethan worked hard, but Daniel's hours at the local machine shop were unpredictable, his paychecks meager. Every unpaid bill seemed to feed the fire between them, small grievances from years past resurrected in each heated exchange. Sometimes, Daniel accused Ethan of caring more for Linda than his own family, his words cutting deeper than he realized. These accusations gnawed at Ethan, fueling guilt and uncertainty. Was he abandoning his brother by seeking happiness elsewhere? Was the dream of a future with Linda worth risking what little family he had left? Tension filled every corner of the Cole house. Mornings began in stony silence, broken only by the clatter of dishes or the slam of a door. Daniel brooded in his room, emerging only to pace the porch or vanish into the night. Ethan, feeling trapped, found himself counting the hours until he could slip away and lose himself in work or in Linda's arms. He longed for escape but couldn't outrun the shadows coiling tighter around him each day. Linda, too, felt the strain. She'd hoped her divorce would bring peace, a fresh start. Instead, Mark's relentless jealousy became a weight she carried everywhere. Sometimes, she found herself glancing over her shoulder, heart pounding at the sight of Mark's truck idling at the curb or the glint of his eyes through a crowd. Once, she returned home to find her tires slashed, a silent warning she could not prove but could not ignore. She confided in Ethan, but he could offer only comfort, not answers. Despite the gathering storm, Ethan and Linda clung to each other. Their affection grew stronger, a fragile shield against the bitterness surrounding them. Some nights, they dreamed together of escaping Staunton, starting fresh somewhere far away, in a place where the past could not reach them. But reality always returned, as relentless as the Virginia humidity pressing against their windows. The sense of unease grew day by day. Ethan caught Mark watching from the shadows outside the diner one evening, his expression cold and unreadable. At home, Daniel's outbursts grew louder, his silences deeper. The lines between friend and foe began to blur. Ethan's circle, once filled with familiar faces and easy trust, now felt like a stage set for betrayal. By early June, Ethan was haunted by the certainty that something terrible was approaching. Every drive through the wooded backroads felt different, each shadow deeper, each rustle in the underbrush more ominous. At night, he lay awake, replaying arguments with Daniel and imagining Mark's next move. Linda's anxious calls became a lifeline, her voice a slender thread holding him back from despair. Still, Ethan tried to hold on to hope. He took long walks through the fields, building plans in his mind for the future. A simple house with Linda, a life where laughter replaced fear. But he could not ignore the sense that his choices were narrowing, that time was running out. The storm was no longer just on the horizon. It was at his door, relentless and unavoidable. In the last quiet days before it broke, Ethan found himself clinging to small moments. A smile from Linda, the sun slipping through the trees, the brief, unspoken truce between brothers sharing a meal. He knew, even then, subhatamu, that such peace was only temporary. Jealousy and resentment, long buried, were about to erupt in ways no one in Staunton could have foreseen. By the first week of June, Staunton's humid evenings pressed down like a blanket. Thunderheads gathered on the horizon each afternoon, and the air was thick with an unspoken sense of anticipation, as if even the cicadas were waiting for something to break. Ethan Cole had always found comfort in the rhythm of the seasons, but now every day felt restless, out of step. He could not shake the feeling that his own life was teetering on the edge of something irreversible. Arguments with Daniel had grown so sharp that Ethan often took to leaving the house just to escape the tension. Daniel's bitterness crackled through their every exchange. Money, Linda. Memories of childhood wrongs that never seemed to fade. Even the comfort Ethan once found in his brother's company had withered away, replaced by suspicion and accusation. When Ethan mentioned his plan to spend a night at Elkhorn Lake, Daniel barely looked up, only muttering that maybe some time apart would do them both good. Linda's voice on the other end of the phone trembled as she pleaded with Ethan to reconsider, but her concern only deepened his resolve. He needed quiet, space to think, to breathe, to decide what the next step should be. He promised he'd call when he got back. She said she believed him, but the worry in her voice lingered in Ethan's ears long after he hung up. That afternoon, Ethan packed his battered old SUV with a sleeping bag, a thermos of black coffee, and a few simple provisions. The forest was familiar to him. He'd hiked those trails since he was a boy, fished at Elkhorn Lake every summer with Daniel, before things between them soured. The woods always seemed to swallow noise and worry, letting a man lose himself in the quiet. Ethan longed for that kind of peace. He left town just before dusk, taking the winding road north, watching as the last rays of sunlight flickered through the windshield. He drove with the windows down, the evening breeze carrying the smell of pine and earth, a mix that reminded him of childhood adventures and simpler times. The closer he got to the national forest, the lighter he felt, as though the troubles of Staunton were fading behind him. The George Washington National Forest was a place of sprawling green, deep shadows, and hidden trails. When Ethan arrived at the secluded turnout near Elkhorn Lake, the parking area was deserted except for a single muddy pickup, which drove off as he pulled in. He watched the taillights disappear into the trees, feeling alone in a way that was both liberating and a little unnerving. He set up camp quickly, spreading his sleeping bag in the back seat of the SUV and propping the doors open to let the last bit of warmth from the day seep in. As darkness gathered, he made his way to the edge of the lake, tossing pebbles into the black water and listening to the frogs begin their nightly chorus. For a brief moment, the weight on his chest lifted. The moon rose, pale and watchful, above the treetops. Ethan thought of Linda, hoping she'd found comfort enough to sleep, and of Daniel, alone in the quiet house. Unbeknownst to Ethan, he had been seen that evening. A hiker passing by noticed the old SUV parked near the lake, its figure distinct against the wild undergrowth. In Staunton, where people kept track of their neighbors, word might have traveled fast. But out here, in the deep woods, a man could vanish, and only the wind would carry the story. Night settled hard and deep. The forest pressed in close, every snap of a twig or distant call of an owl amplified in the darkness. Ethan climbed into his sleeping bag, left the back window cracked open to the cool air, and tried to let his mind drift. He told himself that whatever waited for him in Staunton, whatever anger Mark Harper harbored, whatever bitterness Daniel nursed, could not reach him here. But as he drifted toward uneasy sleep, the shadows lengthened, and the world outside his SUV became a blur of indistinct shapes. The sense of safety he'd felt earlier began to slip away, replaced by an old, familiar tension. Ethan was not a man given to fear, but he could not deny the feeling that something was watching. In the pitch-dark woods, even the bravest heart could falter. He thought again of the arguments that had driven him here, the threats that echoed in his mind, the look in Mark's eyes that last time outside the tavern. He wondered, not for the first time, if he had made the right choice. But it was too late now. The roads were empty, the forest vast, and he was utterly alone. Around midnight, a sudden gust of wind rattled the trees and sent a chill through the SUV. Ethan startled awake, heart pounding, trying to convince himself it was just a dream. He listened, straining for any sound that didn't belong. A car engine, hurried footsteps, the low murmur of voices. But the only answer was the relentless chorus of the forest, indifferent and eternal. He drifted again, half awake, haunted by uneasy dreams, faces flickering through the darkness, voices raised in anger, the crack of a branch or a distant gunshot echoing in his mind. He could not know that outside, someone was indeed moving through the woods, silent and purposeful, drawn by motives Ethan could never have guessed. When morning broke over the lake, the mist rising in ghostly veils, the silence was deep and unbroken. Ethan Cole's SUV sat alone by the water, a quiet witness to the secrets of the night. No one in Staunton could yet imagine how their world was about to change, nor how the forest would keep its grim secret, waiting for someone to discover what had happened beneath its watchful trees. Morning came quietly to the edge of Elkhorn Lake. Early sunlight filtered through the canopy, dappling the forest floor with gold, as birds began their chorus and a low mist drifted over the still water. For most, it was just another peaceful Sunday. But in the woods, two hikers, college students from nearby Harrisonburg, were up before dawn, eager to make the most of the clear weather. They wound along the narrow trails, laughing quietly, not yet knowing the day would be marked forever in their memories. As they broke from the tree line near the lake's deserted parking lot, the first thing they noticed was the battered old SUV, its dull paint streaked with pollen and dust. It looked oddly out of place, parked crooked near the brush, as if abandoned in a hurry. The two paused, uneasy. In this corner of the forest, cars rarely appeared overnight. Curiosity, edged with apprehension, drew them closer. A soft breeze shifted, carrying the faintest metallic tang. They called out, first as a greeting, then with growing alarm, receiving only silence. One, braver than the other, stepped forward, peered through the dirty windows, and stumbled back in shock. The world seemed to tilt and darken. Inside the SUV, partially hidden beneath a rumpled sleeping bag, lay the still form of a man. His hair was dark, streaked with gray, and the lower half of his face was obscured by dried blood. The air inside the car was thick, suffocating, heavy with the unmistakable scent of death. Shaking, the hikers fled back up the trail, hearts pounding, fumbling for a cell phone signal as panic overtook them. The 911 call crackled through the dispatch center in Staunton just after 7. Soon, sirens split the morning stillness, drawing rangers, deputies, and eventually detectives to the scene. The forest transformed from tranquil sanctuary to the center of a nightmare. Yellow tape fluttered in the breeze as law enforcement fanned out, securing the area. The detectives, seasoned men who'd seen their share of violence, grew silent as they surveyed the scene. Ethan Cole, the missing carpenter, had been shot multiple times in the head and chest at close range. Blood stained the back seat and the door, splattered in chaotic patterns. The sleeping bag was pulled haphazardly over his body, as if someone had tried to erase the horror, but had neither the time nor the stomach to finish the job. There were no shell casings to be found. Whoever fired the shots had taken them, careful to leave behind no obvious evidence. The killer had shown a cold, methodical calculation, the kind that comes either from experience or a deep, chilling rage. Yet, despite their efforts, the crime scene was far from clean. Fingerprints had been wiped down, but faint smears remained on the passenger window, and muddy footprints tracked away from the driver's side into the woods. An officer noticed something strange at the rear of the SUV. The gas tank cover hung open, and bits of singed paper protruded from the filler neck. Someone had tried to start a fire, stuffing wads of newsprint in a desperate effort to destroy evidence. But the attempt had failed. The wind must have snuffed out the match, or maybe panic overtook the killer before the deed could be finished. Whatever the reason, the car and the body remained, bearing silent testimony to the violence that had erupted here during the night. News traveled fast in Staunton. By late morning, the edge of the forest buzzed with squad cars, flashing lights, and the low voices of state police and forensic technicians. Cameras clicked, and a few townsfolk gathered in tight knots beyond the tape, whispering stories and speculating in hushed tones. For some, it was just morbid curiosity, but for others, the realization struck hard. This was Ethan Cole, a man many called friend, brother, or neighbor. Detectives worked methodically, combing the woods for footprints, tire tracks, or anything that might have been overlooked. A half-burned cigarette butt was bagged as evidence. Scraps of paper, one with a faint, partial fingerprint, were carefully collected. Everything would be tested, though experience told the investigators not to hope for miracles. The killer had left little behind. Back in town, the news landed like a thunderclap. Daniel Cole, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, was pulled from his home by uniformed officers. He stood on the porch, dazed and trembling, as neighbors gathered to watch. Linda Harper, at work in the florist shop, collapsed in grief when the police arrived to deliver the news. Mark Harper, stoic and silent, watched the commotion from a distance, his expression unreadable. As the investigation stretched into the afternoon, the forest grew quiet again, shadows lengthening across the blood-stained ground. For all the commotion, for all the science and search for answers, the woods kept their secrets. The killer had slipped away before dawn, vanishing into the same silence that now blanketed the crime scene. But Staunton would not forget. The memory of that morning, and of Ethan's lifeless form in the back of his battered SUV, would haunt the town for years to come. A grim reminder that even the most peaceful places can become the setting for unspeakable violence. The discovery at Elkhorn Lake sent ripples of shock through Staunton. But for the police, shock quickly gave way to grim routine. In small towns, murder investigations start with those closest to the victim. Ethan Cole's life, so recently ordinary, was now spread out on whiteboards, photographs pinned and names circled. His secrets, and those of everyone around him, were about to be dragged into the unforgiving light. The detectives didn't have much to go on. No witnesses, no weapon, no shell casings. But three names rose to the top of every list: Daniel Cole, Linda Harper, and Mark Harper. Each had been touched by the storm that gathered around Ethan in the final weeks of his life. Each had a motive. Each had something to lose. Daniel Cole was the first brought in, his face pale and pinched with grief and confusion. Just the day before, he'd argued with his brother about money, another shouting match in a long series. The kind neighbors heard through open windows but pretended not to notice. Now, seated across from two detectives in a cramped interview room, Daniel seemed lost, wringing his hands as he described his last memories of Ethan. He admitted things had been tense. He resented Ethan's focus on Linda, the way he seemed ready to move on and leave Daniel behind. But murder? Daniel could hardly process the accusation. Still, detectives pressed him on his whereabouts the night before, searching for cracks in his alibi. Daniel insisted he'd spent the night at home, neighbors corroborating that his truck never left the driveway, his silhouette passing bucket curtained windows well after midnight. For now, his story held. Next came Linda Harper, her eyes rimmed red, hands trembling as she faced the harsh questions. Love and tragedy mixed in her grief. The memory of Ethan's gentle touch now haunted by the image of his ruined body. The detectives asked about her relationship with Ethan, about her bitter divorce, and, most pointedly, about Mark Harper. Linda admitted to fear, of Mark's anger, of the escalating threats, of what he might have been capable of, but she had her own alibi. The florist shop's security camera showed her locking up after closing, and a neighbor recalled seeing her return home. Phone records backed up her claim, calls with Ethan late into the night, messages growing anxious as he stopped replying. But suspicion lingers, especially when motive is easy to imagine. Had Linda wanted to be free of the conflict between the men in her life? Did her new love push her to an act of desperation? The detectives pressed, but Linda held fast to her story. Every word, every sob, was measured against the cold calculus of evidence. Then came Mark Harper. He arrived at the station uninvited, having heard rumors of his own name being whispered through town. A soldier's bearing still lingered in his stride, but his eyes were sharp and hooded. Mark's relationship with Ethan had never been more than civil, and lately it had curdled into outright hostility. He'd been seen threatening Ethan, words thrown like daggers in public spaces. Motive, the police noted, would be easy to prove. But Mark insisted on his innocence. He claimed he'd been home alone that night, nursing whiskey and watching late-night television. The house, tucked at the edge of town, offered few witnesses, but the bartender at a nearby tavern recalled Mark's arrival just after midnight, too drunk to drive, leaving on foot an hour later. Surveillance footage confirmed part of his story. The time between his departure from the bar and the estimated time of Ethan's death was unaccounted for, but no evidence directly tied him to the scene. For days, the investigation orbited these three: brother, lover, ex-husband. All had motives tangled in jealousy, resentment, or old wounds. Yet every alibi, though imperfect, held under scrutiny. None bore the unmistakable stain of guilt. The detectives scoured Ethan's life for more. Financial records, phone calls, old arguments overheard in the hardware store, the florist's alley, or the machine shop where Daniel worked. But what they found were only the echoes of human frailty, hurt feelings, harsh words, misunderstandings piled up over the years. Meanwhile, forensic teams combed the evidence. The fingerprint lifted from the singed scrap of paper in the gas tank proved too smudged to match. The muddy footprints near the SUV were size 11, common enough to match any of the suspects or half the men in Augusta County. No blood, but Ethan's was found in the vehicle. The crime, so violent and personal, had been executed with chilling precision. As the week dragged on, Staunton's sense of security frayed. Townsfolk debated in barbershops and church basements, dividing into factions. Some sure it was Mark, others pointing at Daniel, still others whispering that Linda had orchestrated it all. Families locked their doors. Children were warned to come home before dark. It seemed impossible that the killer could be someone unknown, some stranger passing through. But as days slipped into weeks, with every interview and every dead end, the truth grew more elusive. Each suspect, scrutinized and grilled, walked away with their secrets intact. The case remained open, but the town's hope for swift justice dimmed, and somewhere, just out of reach, the real answer remained hidden in the silence of the forest, waiting for someone willing to look past the obvious and see what others could not. The forest at Elkhorn Lake had grown still again, the crime scene tape fluttering in the wind long gone, but the shadow it left behind lingered over Staunton. Ethan Cole's murder was the only thing anyone talked about, yet the more the days passed, the less anyone seemed to truly know. Detectives came and went, faces weary and drawn, their voices lowered as if afraid of disturbing the heavy silence that had settled over the case. For all the urgency, the investigation had run headlong into a wall of uncertainty. No matter how many times the detectives retraced their steps, through interviews, phone records, and forensic tests, the same cold facts met them at every turn. There were no fingerprints on the SUV except for Ethan's and a handful of smudged, unreadable partials. The murder weapon, likely a handgun based on the wounds, had disappeared without a trace. The shell casings, so often a key to unlocking the truth, were gone, collected and pocketed by a careful hand that left nothing behind. Not a single drop of foreign DNA turned up in the car, on the sleeping bag, or anywhere else inside the vehicle. Blood evidence, so often a silent witness, told only one story, Ethan's. Even the muddy footprints near the driver's door led nowhere. A pair of size 11 boots, imprinted in soft earth, vanished into the undergrowth after 20 feet, lost in the maze of roots and leaf litter. For all the talk of meticulous calculation, the killer had left behind only a riddle. Detectives tried to break through the impasse by circling back to motive. They grilled Daniel Cole again, searching for a crack in his story, but found nothing new. His anger and jealousy were real, but so was his alibi, supported by more than one neighbor who'd seen his truck sitting idle through the night. Linda Harper, stricken by grief and wary of suspicion, kept her distance, providing work logs and phone records to prove her innocence. Mark Harper, for all his threats, had left behind only the trail of an angry man, not a murderer. His time at the bar was confirmed, and the window in which he could have slipped away was narrow at best. The deeper the detectives dug, the more they were forced to consider a possibility no one wanted to admit: that the killer might not be any of the obvious suspects. Rumors swirled through Staunton. Some whispered that Ethan had been mixed up with the wrong people, maybe a drifter, maybe someone from outside town. Others said he must have known his killer, because who else would come so close in the darkness, strike so personally, then vanish without a sound? Weeks became months. The case, which had once electrified the community, began to recede into the background. Life in Staunton struggled back toward normal, but the sense of security was changed forever. Doors that had once stood open at night were now locked tight. Neighbors eyed each other with a new wariness, and every unfamiliar face in the diner or on Main Street drew a second glance. Linda withdrew further into herself, haunted by loss and suspicion in equal measure. Mark, perhaps sensing that his presence only stirred old wounds, left town for a while, taking a job in another state and leaving the streets a little quieter, but no less tense. Daniel tried to resume his old routines, but his relationship with the town was altered. Some still whispered about him, and a few friendships never fully recovered. For the police, the case remained an open wound. The evidence locker held only a few meager clues: a half-burned cigarette, scraps of paper singed at the edge, a partial fingerprint that matched no one in the system. Leads ran dry. The crime scene had offered its secrets and then closed up tight, as if the woods themselves were conspiring to protect the killer. In the background, stories grew, fueled by fear and the human need for answers. Some believed the murder had been the work of a stranger, perhaps a hunter or a drifter who'd stumbled upon Ethan by chance. Others, unable to let go of suspicion, held fast to the idea that the truth lay closer to home: a grudge, a jealous rage, a betrayal masked by a careful alibi. The detectives, for their part, kept the files open and followed every rumor, but in their hearts they knew the chances of a breakthrough were slim. Cases like these, where the trail turned cold and the evidence faded with time, had a way of haunting even the most hardened investigator. There were nights when the lead detective found himself replaying every detail in his mind, unable to let go. He would picture Ethan Cole, alone in the woods, and wonder if there was something, some detail, some moment, everyone had missed. By the end of the year, the case file was marked Unsolved and moved to a shelf with dozens of others just like it. Yet, in Staunton, the story was far from forgotten. Ethan's friends still gathered every summer at Elkhorn Lake, leaving flowers and tokens by the water's edge. Daniel sometimes visited, standing in silence beneath the trees. Linda stopped driving past the lake altogether, unable to bear the memories, and so the murder of Ethan Cole joined the long list of cold cases, a story half remembered, half explained, always just out of reach. It became part of the town's fabric, a secret wound that never truly healed, its answers buried as deep as the roots of the ancient forest that had borne witness to a single, violent night. As months melted into years, the murder of Ethan Cole cast a long, silent shadow over Staunton. What began as daily gossip faded into uneasy silence, replaced by the kind of haunted glances and quiet condolences reserved for tragedies no one could explain. Life in the small Virginia town moved forward, but something had shifted in the current. A slow erosion of trust, a fracture in the heart of the community that time could not mend. For the Cole family, grief and suspicion lived side by side. Daniel, once inseparable from his brother, found himself alone in a house filled with echoes. The kitchen table where the twins had shared countless late-night talks became a place of solitary meals, the old arguments now rendered meaningless by loss. People stopped calling as often. Some neighbors, unable to let go of their own suspicions, kept their distance, casting sidelong looks when Daniel passed by. Even the friends who believed in his innocence grew uncomfortable, unsure how to bridge the growing gulf of grief and doubt. Daniel carried the weight of that suspicion everywhere. It shaped his posture, carved new lines in his face, and drove him to avoid the familiar places that once brought comfort. At work, conversations stopped when he entered the break room. At the grocery store, whispered rumors drifted just out of earshot. Daniel felt trapped, not just by what had happened, but by the town's refusal to let him move on. Sometimes he found himself replaying the last days with Ethan, wishing for a different ending, searching for a sign he'd missed. Linda Harper's pain was different, quieter, but no less sharp. After Ethan's death, her world shrank to a narrow circle of work and home. She moved through her days with careful detachment, as if keeping her grief hidden might keep the rumors at bay. Yet the whispers still reached her. Some accused her of moving on too quickly. Others hinted darkly about her role in the tragedy. Linda stopped attending church, let friendships drift, and took to spending her evenings alone, lights low, listening to old voicemails from Ethan until the battery on her phone died. The violence had left her afraid. Of Mark Harper, of strangers, of the world itself. She installed new locks on her doors, kept the blinds drawn, flinched at every knock. The fear never truly faded, even as Mark finally left town for good, chasing work and distance in equal measure. With him gone, Staunton seemed quieter, but Linda found little comfort in his absence. The wounds he'd left, visible and invisible, would not heal so easily. Ethan's name lingered in Staunton, spoken with regret and confusion. To many, he was the kind man who had fixed fences, carried groceries, built porches and friendships alike. People placed flowers at his grave every June, the anniversary marked by somber gatherings at the lake where he'd died. But beneath these rituals, a question remained, one that hung in the air, unanswered, growing heavier with each passing year. Who had killed Ethan Cole, and why? As the official investigation faded, the case became the stuff of local legend. Teenagers dared each other to spend the night near Elkhorn Lake, spinning stories about the ghost of Ethan Cole, searching for justice in the moonlight. Older townsfolk shook their heads at such talk, but even they found themselves glancing over their shoulders on lonely stretches of road, uneasy with memories that refused to fade. For the detectives who had worked the case, the lack of resolution gnawed at their sense of purpose. Cold case files collected dust on shelves, but Ethan's file never stayed buried for long. Every so often, a new rumor would reach the police station. A stranger spotted in town, a half-remembered argument, a claim from a drifter passing through. Each time, hope flared briefly before being extinguished by the same dead ends. No evidence, no new leads, no answers. Meanwhile, the forest where Ethan died remained unchanged, indifferent to the pain it had witnessed. Seasons cycled, leaves turning gold, snow softening the earth, spring rains filling the lake again and again. The site became a place of private pilgrimage for those who remembered him. Daniel, weathered by years of loss, visited less often, but when he did, he would stand in silence by the water, searching the shifting surface for some sign. A ripple, a reflection, a voice from the past. The years carved new stories into the town, but the wound never truly healed. Ethan's murder became a quiet caution, a reminder that evil could take root even in the most familiar soil. Newcomers learned the story quickly, sensing the invisible wall around those who'd lived through it. Children grew up warned not to linger in the woods alone, and every unexplained sound in the night brought old fears rushing back. Yet, in the quietest hours, there remained a faint, stubborn hope. Some believed that one day the truth would surface, that secrets buried in silence could not stay hidden forever. But for most, there was only the long, uneasy waiting, each year marking the distance from a summer when everything changed, and a town learned how fragile peace could be. 6 years slipped by, and with them most hope of solving Ethan Cole's murder. Life in Staunton trudged on, marked each June by somber gatherings and muted grief. Daniel grew older, face etched with loss, and Linda learned to live with a knot of anxiety that never truly dissolved. Some wounds became routine, quiet sorrow, nervous glances, memories that faded at the edges but never vanished. The murder was now an accepted scar, a mystery so cold it chilled the soul of the whole town. Then, in the late spring of 1998, a stranger arrived at the Staunton police station. He introduced himself as Kirk Bellamy, just a name from old files to most, but for a handful of officers and townsfolk, the name rang a faint bell. Bellamy had once been an acquaintance of Mark Harper's, a figure who'd drifted in and out of the town's periphery, never staying long, never giving anyone reason to remember him clearly. Bellamy's eyes were tired, shoulders hunched as if carrying a burden he'd finally grown too weary to bear. He told the desk officer he had information about the murder at Elkhorn Lake, information that couldn't wait any longer. At first, the officers doubted him. Over the years, the case had attracted more than its share of false confessions and wild theories. But something in Bellamy's haunted gaze made them pause and listen. In a quiet room with only the hum of the fluorescent lights and the scratch of a detective's pen, Bellamy began his story. 6 years earlier, he'd been drinking with an old military buddy, Gregory Price, known to some in Staunton, but more familiar to Mark's circle than Ethan's. Bellamy described a night marked by anger, too much whiskey, and talk of old grievances that never healed. Mark Harper's name came up, along with Ethan's, and with them, the tangled web of jealousy and loss that had haunted all their lives. What Bellamy recounted was chilling in its detail. He claimed that Gregory Price, agitated and drunk, had decided to confront Ethan. In Bellamy's account, Price left the house late that night, taking a gun from his truck and driving alone out into the darkness, headed for George Washington National Forest. Bellamy, already uneasy, tried to dissuade him, but Price was beyond listening. What happened next unfolded like a nightmare. According to Bellamy, Price found Ethan's SUV parked near Elkhorn Lake. Under cover of night, Price approached, gun in hand, and fired through the open window, once, then again and again, in a fury fueled by old grudges and too much drink. Bellamy said Price watched Ethan collapse, blood spreading fast, then panicked as the finality of his actions hit him. But the horror didn't end there. Price, now desperate to cover his tracks, searched the SUV for shell casings, wiping down surfaces, trying to erase any trace of himself. He stuffed paper into the gas tank, intending to set the vehicle and Ethan's body aflame, but his hands shook too badly to finish the job. As dawn crept through the trees, Price fled, vanishing into the woods before anyone else arrived. Bellamy's confession brought a surge of activity to a case long considered unsolvable. Detectives cross-referenced his story with what little evidence remained. The missing shell casings, the attempt to burn the SUV, the partial fingerprint on a piece of singed newsprint. The details fit, too closely to be dismissed as coincidence. Word of the confession spread quickly, reviving pain and fear that had never fully faded. Daniel, numb with shock, found himself reliving the worst days of his life. Linda wept alone in her living room, her grief given new edge by the knowledge that Ethan's killer had been so close all along. Mark Harper, whose life had become a series of restless moves and unfinished jobs, was brought back for questioning, but Bellamy's account and the evidence pointed elsewhere. Police tracked down Gregory Price, whose military record and history of violence were already known to law enforcement. When confronted, Price denied everything at first, but cracks soon appeared in his story. He contradicted himself in interviews, grew defensive, and finally broke down under the weight of mounting evidence and his own conscience. In a moment of weary surrender, he confessed, his words a jumbled mix of regret, rage, and broken memories. The town of Staunton, so long in the grip of uncertainty, now confronted the truth. The killer was not a family member, not the bitter ex-husband or the resentful brother, but a man from the outer circles, driven by alcohol, jealousy, and old alliances. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. Some were relieved, others unsettled by how easily suspicion had fractured their trust in each other. The confession brought closure, but it did not erase the years of pain and suspicion. Daniel and Linda, each marked by their own scars, had to find their way through a new world, one where the past could never be undone, but where, at last, some answers could be spoken aloud. And in the quiet woods around Elkhorn Lake, the silence remained. Only now, it was filled with the ghosts of memory and the hard, cold truth that sometimes the real story waits for years before anyone is ready or willing to listen. As the years wound on and the confession of Gregory Price closed one chapter in Staunton, the town slowly began to breathe again. Yet, for those who paid attention, or who found themselves sleepless at night, lost in the gravity of unsolved stories, Ethan Cole's tragedy was a mirror for another, real and raw, that had gripped this corner of Virginia nearly 3 decades before. Samuel Edward "Sammy" Wheeler. The name didn't echo in YouTube documentaries or fill the pages of best-selling true crime books, but in the hills and hollows around George Washington National Forest, everyone knew it. Sammy, like Ethan in the story, was a gentle soul, a man with a ready smile, a quick hand to help, and a future as ordinary as any, until violence found him. His murder, on a warm night in June of 1992, would reshape families, friendships, and the very spirit of the town. Sammy's story played out with eerie similarity to Ethan's. He'd set out for a night in the peace of the woods, searching for calm and space away from conflict, a simple desire, and one that anyone who'd ever needed to escape could understand. The next morning, hikers would stumble upon his car by the lake, the serenity of the forest broken forever. Sammy, shot multiple times, left behind a scene that told the same story of panic, rage, and the desperate attempts of a killer to erase their crime. For years, suspicion clouded the lives of those closest to him. Sammy had a twin brother, just as Ethan had Daniel, and in the fevered imagination of investigators and neighbors, twins made for a kind of symmetry, a double life, a double motive. Like Linda, Sammy's girlfriend became a focus of scrutiny, her every action parsed for hidden meaning. And then there was the ex-husband, a figure out of central casting for suspicion, rough around the edges, jealous, and quick to anger. Staunton was no stranger to rumor, and with so little evidence, stories grew wild as kudzu vines. Old friends kept their distance, families withdrew, and the annual gatherings at Elkhorn Lake became less about healing and more about enduring another season of unanswered questions. Law enforcement, stretched thin and haunted by dead ends, pressed on through years of cold leads and false hopes. They watched as life carried on around them. As children grew up and houses changed hands, the past never truly put to rest. The breakthrough, when it came, seemed almost accidental, a ripple set off by a voice willing, at last, to unburden itself. A man named Guy Jackson Price, connected through old military friendships and shared bars with the men in Sammy's circle, entered the picture. A witness, driven by conscience or weariness, or perhaps a desperate need to put ghosts to rest, stepped forward. He described a night gone wrong, a man driven by drink and anger and the aftermath. Shell casings gone, evidence nearly burned, silence in the woods as thick as the June fog. It was enough for law enforcement to finally connect the threads. Guy Jackson Price was arrested, tried, and, against the odds, convicted for the murder of Sammy Wheeler. In 1999, after 7 long years, the sentence was handed down: life behind bars. For a moment, it seemed that justice had prevailed, that the wound in the heart of the community might finally close. But the world seldom offers clean endings. Nearly 30 years after the killing, in the spring of 2020, Guy Jackson Price was released on parole. He returned to a world much changed, a town that had tried to move on, a forest that had outlived every human drama beneath its boughs. For some, Price's release reopened old wounds, a reminder that in the real world, consequences shift and justice is never as permanent as stone. Others, numbed by time, felt only the dull ache of memory, their anger spent after decades of sorrow. The real-life case, its twists, heartbreaks, and unresolved questions, gave shape to Ethan Cole's story, and in turn, to every listener drawn to mysteries that refused to stay silent. The parallels were impossible to ignore. The lake, the twins, the suspicion that wrapped around friends and family until everyone was both victim and suspect. But for all the similarities, one truth stood out. There is no closure in violence, no comfort in the unraveling of old wounds. What remained was not justice, but the bittersweet recognition that answers, when they come, can never undo the pain. Sammy Wheeler's legacy, like Ethan's, endures in the memories of those who loved him. The forest stands as witness, a place where secrets once buried beneath moss and pine needles finally, painfully, surfaced. Every June, when the air grows thick and the lake lies mirror still, someone will leave flowers on the shore. A silent gesture in honor of a life ended too soon. And for those who still search for meaning in unsolved stories, the message is both warning and hope. No matter how cold a case becomes, no matter how carefully secrets are hidden, truth, like grief, never truly disappears. It waits, patient and silent, for the day it is finally brought into the light. The years had not dulled the ache of loss for those who had loved Ethan Cole, nor erased the sharp wound the murder had left in Staunton. But as time wound onward, the story shifted from a fresh pain to something deeper, a quiet, complicated lesson about the nature of justice, the passage of time, and the stubborn persistence of memory. The murder of Ethan Cole, like the real-life tragedy of Sammy Wheeler, became more than just a collection of evidence or the subject of whispered conversations in barbershops and church halls. It became a mirror for the community, a dark, fractured glass through which people glimpsed their own fears and vulnerabilities. It was a reminder that even the kindest life can be ended in an instant, that violence is never as far away as anyone wants to believe, and that the answers people crave are often slower and sadder than they hope. For Daniel Cole, the years after the truth came out were marked by a slow, painful healing. With the killer finally named and the real story dragged into the light, suspicion toward him faded, but the scars remained. Daniel never returned to the house he and Ethan had shared. Instead, He left Staunton for a quieter life, trying to find a place where the past could not reach him. Sometimes, though, on quiet evenings, the memories drifted back. The laughter of two boys running through wildflowers, the quiet pride of building a porch together, the final, unbridgeable silence between them. Grief, he found, never truly left. It only softened, growing into something quieter, a dull ache in the heart. Linda Harper, too, had to rebuild. For years, her life was hemmed in by fear and rumor. Her love story with Ethan turned into a cautionary tale, her name forever linked to tragedy. Yet after the case was finally closed, she found a measure of peace. She moved to a new town, started over, and began to speak about Ethan with fondness rather than dread. Still, on the anniversary of his death, she would light a candle and sit by the window, watching the darkness and remembering the man who had once given her hope. For the detectives who had spent sleepless nights circling the same facts, the case was a humbling reminder that justice could be delayed, diverted, sometimes even denied. The breakthrough hadn't come from clever deduction or forensic brilliance, but from the slow, grinding work of years, and from the unexpected courage of a conscience finally unable to carry its own secret. The lesson was clear. Every case, no matter how cold, leaves traces. Some are written in blood and bone. Others are inscribed on hearts and memories, impossible to erase. In Staunton, the years rolled by. Children grew up learning the story of Ethan Cole, their curiosity caught by the mystery and sadness that hung over the lake and the woods. Some of them, restless on summer nights, would sneak out to the water's edge, daring each other to whisper his name or catch a glimpse of his ghost. For older generations, the story was a warning, a reminder that peace was precious, and that one violent act could reverberate through decades, shaping lives far beyond a single night. Each June on the anniversary, people still gathered by Elkhorn Lake. Some brought flowers, others simply stood in silence, eyes closed, letting the hush of the forest fill the space between the living and the dead. There was no official ceremony, no speeches or prayers, just the unspoken understanding that remembering was itself an act of resistance, a refusal to let the past slip quietly away. The cold case files gathered dust on the police station shelves. But Ethan's story lived on in the details, the old SUV rusting beneath the trees, the photograph of two brothers smiling on the porch, the quiet resilience of those who had lost and learned to go on living. Even as new tragedies unfolded, and as time worked its slow alchemy on grief, there was comfort in the knowledge that truth, however late, had finally come. For all its pain, the story of Ethan Cole and of Sammy Wheeler held a lesson at its core, that life is fragile and justice may sleep, but it never truly dies. Secrets can fester in silence for years, but truth has a way of rising to the surface, called forth by memory, conscience, and the unbreakable bonds of love. And so, as the sun sets behind the hills and the lake settles into evening calm, Staunton carries on, changed, marked, but never broken. The mystery that once tore at the heart of the community now serves as a quiet testament to resilience, the refusal to let darkness have the last word. For those who have followed this story, may you carry its lessons with you. Hold your loved ones close. Speak the truth, even when it is difficult. And remember, no secret, no matter how deeply buried, can remain hidden forever. If you want to follow more chilling true crime and cold case stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next episode.